All right, day 18 of Peak. This is our next to the last day. I'm going to start reading to you. There will be some things you'll need to do at the end that will be on it'll be on the slide after where we finish reading today, and that will be in a separate video. All right, camp 3.5. Zopa pushed us hard for the next 2 days, and we were out of camp before dawn climbing with headlamps. Yogi and Yash were always long gone before we started out, and we didn't see them until we stopped at the end of the day. I had no idea where we were, but according to my altimeter watch, we were gaining altitude. Not that I needed the watch. Every breath was painful now. At the end of the day, it was all Sunjo and I could do to eat a little food, drink, and then crawl into our bags. On the third morning, I was surprised to open my eyes and see sunlight coming through the blue tent fabric. I looked over at Sunjo and saw that he was staring at the light too. We had barely talked in the past few days, no time and no breath. How are you doing? I asked. Not well, Sunjo said. You've done okay the last couple of days. He shook his head. It's been very hard. That was an understatement. We had done several technical climbs the past 48 hours. It had been some of the most difficult climbing I've ever done. Any idea where we are? Sunjo sat up with a groan. Feels like we're on the summit. I laughed, which turned into a short but painful coughing fit, and when I recovered, I said maybe Zopa is going to give us the day off. Not likely. We went through the contortions of getting dressed in our small tent, then crawled out, light snow and freezing fog. We hadn't seen the sky in 3 days. Yogi and Yash were crouching next to the camp stove. Yogi said something that made Sunjo blanch. What? I asked. Zopa is sick. I understood why he was upset. Zopa didn't get sick. Zopa was the Iron Man. He had seemed fine the night before when we got to camp and we hurried over his tent. He looked terrible. Bloodshot eyes, runny nose, pale, but he managed to sit up in his sleeping bag when he saw us. We'll go to Camp 4 this afternoon, he said. He wasn't going anywhere in his condition. The virus? I asked. I think so, he answered with a slight smile. Or maybe it's just age. Regardless, Sunjo said, we should go back down. We need to get you help. We cannot go down, Zopa said. The Chinese are waiting for us. The only escape is up. We have to come down eventually, I said, but not on this side. What are you talking about? Nepal is a little more than a mile away from here. I thought he was delirious or something. It would take days to reach the Friendship Bridge into Nepal. He took out the map and he pointed to the south side of the summit. This is Nepal, he said. He pointed to the north side. This is Tibet. He walked his fingers up the north side of Everest and then down the south side. You mean we're not coming back down the north side into Tibet, I asked. When you reach the summit, he said, you'll head south into Nepal. But we're not set up for the south side, I protested. We don't have tents or gear or... Sherpas will help you, Zopa said, friends of mine. We've already gotten word to them. They'll be waiting on the other side. Yogi and Yash will take you to the summit. What about you? Sunjo asked. As you can see, I am in no condition to climb. Camp 4 is as far as I'll be going. Then we'll wait until you get better, Sunjo insisted. That's right, I said. I don't care if we get up to the summit for my birthday. It's not important to me anyway. We'll get up to camp somewhere. We'll set up a camp somewhere or stay here until you get better. Zopa shook his head. We don't have enough food or supplies. Yogi and Yash can get more supplies from the other Sherpas. That's not the only obstacle, Zopa said. The weather. In 3 days it will be good for a summit attempt and you will have to be in position. I glanced back outside. It was snowing harder and the fog had thickened. How can you know that? Zopa shrugged. He was impossible. Okay, I said, so the weather breaks and we make it to the summit and somehow make it down the south side. How are you going to get past the Chinese soldiers on the north side? I'm a Nepalese citizen in Tibet with legal papers. Captain Shek has no grounds to arrest me. You saw what happened the last time he tried, and I don't think I will be caught. But if I am, the very worst he can do is deport me, which is what I want anyway. I'll see you both on the other side. I don't think I can make it to the summit, Sunjo said. I had a lot of trouble yesterday. I'm afraid I've put you in a terrible situation, Sunjo, Zopa said. You will have to make the summit now. I thought about offering to stay with Zopa at Camp 4 and help him down the mountain after he got better, but this was clearly not in keeping with my mother's instructions to stay selfish. And I did want to get to the summit. The debate was resolved by Zopa. He gave me a monkish smile. I don't need your help, Peak, but Sunjo will. I just stared at him, relieved that I didn't have to make my decision and stunned that he seemed to have read my mind. How? Zopa held up his hand. Sanjo will not reach the summit without your help, he said. I need to rest, and so do both of you. We have a hard climb ahead of us. Sanjo took Zopa's advice, and I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. I joined Yogi and Yash at the fire, and Yogi pulled out an oxygen tank with a mask out of his pack. He showed me how to attach the mask to the regulator. Then he held up 2 fingers, indicating that I was to set the dial at 2 liters per minute, and then, using Yash as a model, he showed me how to put on the mask. When he finished, he took everything apart and had me put it all back together. It wasn't as easy as it looked. I had to pull off my outer mitts, and my fingers went numb in spite of the fact that I was still wearing gloves. This reminded me that I still had JR's little video camera in my pack. I had completely forgotten about it. I needed to start filming our trip, which should give you a little idea of how the brain functions or doesn't function at high altitudes. I managed to get the mask hooked up to the tank, and then I put the mask on and I tried to adjust the straps for a tight fit over my nose and mouth. The mask was cold, uncomfortable, and a little claustrophobic. Yash had the perfect solution to the discomfort. He turned on the oxygen. In my whole entire life, I had never felt anything so wonderful. The O's flowed into my body like some kind of magical elixir, and for the first time in weeks, I felt warm, sharp, and strong. The feeling was short-lived because Yogi turned it off almost immediately. Reluctantly, I took off the mask, and the Sherpa brothers were smiling at me. Yogi said something in Nepalese and then held up 5 fingers. Got it, I said. Not until Camp 5. Theoretically, you could use O's all the way up the mountain. The problem was that you'd use half a dozen Sherpas to carry enough oxygen tanks to get you up the mountain. The tanks just didn't last that long. Yogi and Yash left around noon, and a couple of hours later, Zopa came out of his tent looking like a corpse emerging from a tomb. 3 mugs of hot tea seemed to revive him a little. I packed his gear, then roused Sanjo, who looked a lot better after his nap. We started out for Camp 4. This time, Sanjo and I had to wait for Zopa about halfway there. He put on an oxygen mask and he cranked it up. This certainly put a little more spring into his step, and I was envious. Camps 5 and 6. Because of our late start, I thought Camp 4 was close, but we didn't get to the dreaded wall leading up to it until well after dark. We're climbing the wall at night? I asked, shocked. Zopa took off his mask. It's the only way to get to Camp 4 unnoticed. Everyone will be asleep. They would be in the tents all night. The wind was howling, and it hadn't stopped snowing all day. But from our last experience, I knew that they wouldn't be sleeping. If they were like me when I was up there, they would be lying in their sleeping bags, wondering if there was enough air to keep them alive through the night. The last time we were here, it took me over 5 hours to reach the top, and I nearly gave up on the way, and the weather was worse now, and it was dark. The last time we were here, Yogi and Yash had thrown a rope over the side for us to use. You'll need headlamps, Zopa said. Right, I said. Slide the Jumar up the rope. Step. Breathe. Jumar. Step. Jumar. Think. Look up. Think again. Step. Rest. Rest, rest, hug the wall, pray, the same routine, but in a strange way the climb was easier, or at least less scary. With the headlamps, the light kept me focused on the ice and rock in front of me. I had no idea where the top or the bottom was until the light appeared over the edge about 10 feet above me. It was Yogi, although it was hard to tell. Bundled up like he was, I managed to get to the top without him having to grab me, and as I rested on my knees to catch my breath and not puke. I looked at my watch. I had climbed the wall in less than 5 hours this time. 15 minutes later, Sanjo came over the top looking like he was about to pass out, and I shouted in his ear that he had made it up the wall half an hour faster than he had the last time. This seemed to cheer him up and managed to get him to his feet. Zopa was last. He was in terrible shape. It took all 3 of us to pull him over the edge, and when we got him there, he didn't move. I checked his oxygen tank. It was empty. Yogi hurried off and came back with a fresh tank for Yash. They got the O's flowing and carried Zopa to their tent, and after an hour or so, he recovered enough to open his eyes and drink something, and a few minutes later, he asked the brothers if they had heard anything from Josh. I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me. The Chinese soldier climbers had reached ABC that afternoon and were planning on staying there a day or 2 before climbing to Camp 4. They had checked everyone's papers and searched all the tents, and the climbers at ABC said the soldiers were in great shape and made terrific time. There was no doubt that they were going to try for the summit. This seemed like the worst possible news, but Zopa didn't seem disturbed by it at all. You'll be a day ahead of them. Tonight and tomorrow you will rest. The following morning before light, you'll climb to Camp 5. What about you? Sunjo asked. Do you really think that you're going to be worried about a sick old monk when they get up here? If they are such good climbers, the soldiers will want to try for the summit. Which of them will stay behind to escort the old man down the mountain? He gave a wheezy laugh, and by the time they get back, I'll be gone. Why can't we just go to Camp 5 when it gets light? I asked. We'll be just that much farther ahead of the soldiers. There'll be a storm in a few hours, Zopa answered. Tomorrow morning is your window. The storm hit us mid-morning. If we had left when I wanted, we would have been halfway to Camp 5 and we would have died, along with the other 3 climbers who did leave that morning. None of them made it to Camp 5 and nobody could help them. The weather was too severe. I tried to write in my Moleskine and found that I couldn't concentrate long enough to string more than 2 or 3 words together at a time. After a while, I gave up and managed to get a little sleep, and so did Sunjo, mostly because there was nothing else to do but lie in the tent. Zopa didn't want us wandering around camp, not that we had the energy, and the storm was so bad that everyone there was hunkered down waiting for it to stop. About 8 o'clock that night, it did, and suddenly, one moment the wind and snow were threatening to blow our tent away. The next moment, it was perfectly calm, and I stuck my head outside the tent along with everyone else in the camp and saw a perfectly clear sky overhead, scattered with bright stars. Yash left for Camp 5 3 hours ahead of us to get the camp ready. Yogi stuck his head into our tent an hour before we were to leave and told us to pack our gear. We weren't taking much with us. Most of what we needed would be waiting for us at Camp 5. Yogi and Yash had hauled it up the last time we were at Camp 4. Before we took off, we checked in with Zopa. He was sitting up and drinking a mug of tea. He was off the O's, and some of the color had returned to his face, but he still looked pretty weak. Speed is everything now. If you stay in the death zone too long, you will die. If you don't reach the summit by 1:30 p.m. on the day you leave Camp 6, I have asked Yogi and Yash to turn you around. It is better to be caught by the Chinese than it is to die on the mountain. This seemed to contradict his plan to get Sunjo over the top to safety, but he was right. From Camp 6, you have to reach the summit and return in about 18 hours. Oxygen or not, there was a limit to how long you could survive above Camp 6. If we made the summit, we would have to reach the top camp on the other side in 18 hours. Have Yogi and Yash been to the summit? I asked. It had been a question on my mind since Zopa had announced that he wasn't taking us there himself. Of course, Zopa said 3 times. Good, I said. Does Josh know you're not coming with us? Zopa shook his head, then gave us a blessing and said, I'll see you both in Kathmandu. Now go. It was clear and bitterly cold, and we left the dark camp and started on the North Ridge to the summit. It was hard to keep my excitement in check. A night at Camp 5, a night at Camp 6, then the top of the world. It was more of a forced march to Camp 5 than a climb. We hooked onto a series of fixed ropes Yogi had set in place, tried a regime of 12 steps a minute of gasping to recover, and then another 12 steps. After an hour, it was down to about 8 steps, and I'm not sure how many minutes to recover. And it was hard to believe that some climbers made it to the summit without any supplemental O's at all. Josh was one of them, although I suspected on this trip he would be sucking down the O's, if for no other reason than to stay sharp so he didn't lose one of his clients. The sun came up and gave us the best view of Everest pyramidal summit yet. It was enormous. Coming off the top of the top was a disc of ice crystals against the blue sky. The sight inspired my sluggish brain to remember the camera, which I had put in my pocket before we left Camp 4. I shouted ahead to Sunjo to wait up, which he was more than happy to do. When I got to him, I took off my outer mittens and pushed record button and tried to imitate JR as best I could. What are you feeling right now? I asked. You're less than a mile from the highest point on Earth. I had him framed perfectly against the summit. Frightened, Sunjo said, and hopeful, and worried about my grandfather. I had no idea it would be this hard. That's about all my unmittened fingers could take. I can film you now if you like, Sunjo offered. Nah, that's all right. We need to get moving. About an hour and a half later, we saw our first corpse. Sunjo saw it first, and I walked up to him, and he was staring down at it. Yogi had breezed by as if he hadn't noticed, but I bet he had. It was a woman. About 50 feet away was another corpse. I couldn't tell what it was because it was lying face down. I'd never seen a dead person, let alone a frozen dead person. She looked more like a wax figure than a former human being, and in a way, this was even more disturbing to me. She had been there a while, if her shredded clothes were any indication. It looked like she had died sitting up and had fallen over to the side. She was only a few hours from her tent at Camp 4, and I'm not sure how long we stood there staring. And we would have stood there a lot longer if Yogi hadn't shouted for us to hurry up. After 5 more corpses, I stopped looking. At noon, we came to a steeper part of the North Ridge. It was much colder. The fixed ropes were frozen, and Sherpas had chipped shallow steps into the ice to make it easier to climb. Yogi waited for us to catch up to him. He pointed to the tents down at Camp 4 and then the tents up at Camp 5, and he said something in Nepalese. Halfway, Sanjo translated, 6 hours to go. To make it that 6 hours worse, the wind picked up. We had to bend over as we climbed so we weren't blown off the ridge. My initial excitement was gone. I think the only thing that kept me going were the O's waiting for me up ahead. I don't know what kept Sanjo going, and probably the Chinese climbers behind him and freedom ahead. We got to Camp 5 a little before 7, 25,196 feet. It seemed impossible that we could ever go any farther. It was the end of the world, and it really wasn't a camp. It was a series of cleared platforms stretching up the North Ridge for at least a quarter of a mile, with absolutely no shelter from the howling wind. The big platforms could hold 5 or 6 tents, and the small platforms 1 or 2. Several of the platforms had tents on them, but it was hard to say how many people were up there. I suspected most of the tents were waiting for climbers coming up from Camp 4 or down from Camp 6 to the summit attempt. Our tiny rubble pile was just big enough for 2 tents pitched on the garbage of former occupants. Yash had water boiling for tea, but what I was interested in was the mask strapped to his face, pumping O's into his lungs. He was moving twice as fast as we were. I grabbed the tank from a pile and pulled the mask out of my pack and hooked it up and stuck my face in it. The feeling I had was with the first lungful of oxygen was indescribable. Bliss is about as close as I can come, but it was way beyond that. Yash helped Sanjo set up his rig, and when we got it on, we looked at each other and started laughing. We were going to live. We might even make it to the summit. The Chinese are heading up to Camp 4 tomorrow, one of the climbers from ABC told Josh. You're kidding, Josh said. What about acclimatization? These guys are acclimated. One of the climbers speaks a little Chinese. They told that they were up on K2 when they were ordered to come here. They haven't said it, but I don't think they're coming back down until they take a shot at the summit. They're like climbing machines. When are you heading up? The day after tomorrow if the weather's good. Josh answered. I was going to hold off a little longer, but I took my people out for a climb today, and they all did pretty well. The virus seems to have run its course. We're heading up to Camp 4 in the morning. We'll see you on the way back down. Good luck. Out. This was probably the last transmission we would hear. I wondered if Josh would be worried when he didn't pass me on his way up. I asked Sanjo how he was doing. The oxygen helps, but I'm still concerned. I had a lot of trouble today. You're not the only one. It's hard up here. I have to make it, he said, for my sisters and my mother. Those are great reasons to risk your life, I thought. But what was I doing it for? For Josh's business? For my ego? Now that my brain had oxygen, I found myself really missing my 2 Ps. The 2 Ps and my mom, and even Rolf. This got me to thinking about the corpses we saw on the way up here, who they had left behind. These were very uncomfortable questions to fall asleep to. The oxygen was wonderful, but the masks were a pain in the butt to sleep in. It's hard to find a position where the straps didn't dig into your face. Also, the exhaust system stank. Small pools of icy slime collected in the mouthpiece valve. When it moved my head, slushy spit ran down my neck. Because of all this, Sanjo and I were up early. We reached and rechecked our gear. Leaving something behind like a spare headlamp battery or a glove could be a death sentence. Yogi took the lead this time, leaving Yash to take us up to Camp 6. The first obstacle was a steep snowfield that we had to 4-point with ice axes, and crampons. Stupidly, I assumed that now we were on O's, it would be like climbing at sea level. Nothing could be further from the truth. By the time we reached the top of the snowfield, my lungs were screaming for air, and I thought it was something the matter with my mask and the tank had run out of oxygen. but everything was working perfectly. 2 liters of oxygen didn't simulate sea level. It simply allowed me to stay alive above 25,000 feet. And there was a huge difference between lying in a tent doing virtually nothing and climbing a steep snowfall on all fours. I took the little camera out and filmed Sunjo crabbing his way up to me. By the expression on his face, I could see he was having the same revelation that I had just had. I don't think I can make it, he gasped. I'm serious, Peak. This is too much. We just pushed it too hard up in the field, I said, with the confidence that I didn't feel. We'll have to pace ourselves. He nodded, but there was fear in his eyes, and I knew exactly how he felt. We had passed another 3 or 4 corpses on the way up. A few hours later, I stopped to rest and looked at my altimeter watch, which had just passed 26,000 feet, and we were officially in the death zone. Every minute from now on, we were dying just a little. We stumbled into Camp 6 like 3 zombies. Yogi had the tents up, but he didn't look much better than we did. He told Sunjo to get our stove going to boil snow and drink as much water as we could. The very idea of drinking or eating anything made my stomach lurch. I turned on the video camera and caught Sunjo lighting the stove, or trying to light the stove. It must have taken him 50 strokes to get the cigarette lighter going in the thin air, and when it finally ignited, his thumb was bleeding like he had sliced it open with a knife. We gagged down as much water and food as we could, and then we wrapped in our sleeping bags to wait. Sleep was out of the question. The inside of the tent was filled with a thin layer of frost from our breath, and every time one of us moved, the freezing crystals fell onto our faces. They say that when you die, your life flashes before your eyes. Mine was passing before my eyes in slow motion, like a horror movie. I think it was the corpses that did it. I thought of my mom falling off that wall, the boy I never met falling off the Flatiron Building, and Sunjo hanging by a thread on that ice wall, and Sunjo's father saving my father, then dying of heart failure. The only thing that stopped the depressing playback was the tent flap opening and the appearance of Yogi's masked face. We go, he said. Well, not quite. It was more like, we get ready to go. They made us drink more water and then told us to do our toilet, which was a whole lot easier said than done at 30 degrees below zero. 2 hours later, we were ready. We left for the summit of Mount Everest, and I looked at my watch. It was 1:35 a.m., and we had 12 hours to get there. Now, on the next slide, you're going to find your instructions and another video that will help you to know what you're going to do for an assignment.